and being a part of Hope Church KC Online. This morning we have a special treat as we get ready to move into our message. It's my honor to introduce our speaker. He's not necessarily a guest, he's one of us. He's one of our elders here at Hope Church. And if you've been watching over the course of the summer, then you've heard a message from him before several months ago. And so Greg Frona is going to give us a wonderful encouragement today about what God will do in our life if we feel like we don't know what to do, where to go, or we feel stuck. And so if that describes in any way how you feel right now, then sit back, grab a cup of coffee, and enjoy how God would encourage you through Greg this morning.
It is so good to be back with my church family, to be able to bring God's word to you today, to share a message of hope and encouragement with you. Whether you're watching live with us this morning at 10 o'clock, or maybe you're checking in at another time, just so grateful that you're carving out some moments in your life to be able to hear what God might want to say to you. Whenever I have an opportunity to prepare a message, it always does my heart good. It does my spiritual life good. It does my faith good, knowing that God is still active and He's still working and He still wants to change me as He wants to change you. Today we're going to talk a little bit about what it feels like to be stuck. I don't know about you, but I don't like to be stuck. I don't like to be stuck in traffic. I don't like to be stuck in the snow. And I don't like to be stuck on word puzzles that I tend to like to do in the newspaper. I've been known to go out of my way 5 or 10 miles just so I wouldn't have to sit in traffic. And maybe you can relate to that. Feeling stuck never feels good. And it's one thing to be stuck in traffic or because of weather conditions or on a puzzle, but it's a completely different thing to be stuck relationally. It's different to be stuck in a career that seems to be going nowhere. And it's certainly difficult to be stuck spiritually. I don't know if you can relate to any of those areas of being stuck, but I know when I have found myself in difficult circumstances, there are certain ways that I react or I respond when I feel confined. And I don't even know where that sense of confinement came from. Maybe it was when I was 6 years old. My brother put me in my mom's clothes dryer. And I don't know if he just put me in there. I don't think I would have willingly gone in there. But not only did he put me in there, then he decided it would be a good idea to hit the button. And I am so glad that I had the wherewithal to push that door open, because otherwise I might be a few inches shorter. But you know, when I find myself being stuck, there are several reactions that I have. The first one is to flee the situation. And maybe you've been there. At the first sign of discomfort, at the first sign of uncertainty, maybe your inclination is to flee. So the relationship isn't going well, and so you run to another relationship. Or the job hasn't gone or hasn't met your expectations. And so immediately you're scanning the want ads. You're looking online for new work just because you feel stuck in the career that you're in. And maybe you feel stuck spiritually. And so your remedy for that has been to go from church to church to church, just to flee the situation and to find something new. But what I've learned about myself, and maybe you can even come to relate to a little bit, is that we're the common denominator. So no matter where we go, we're still going to feel stuck if something else doesn't change about who we are or our outlook and our focus. And maybe if you don't tend to flee, sometimes it's easy just to settle in, to flounder, to feel like this is all there is. And we resign ourselves to thinking, well, if I'm stuck, I'm just stuck. And we don't make any effort to get unstuck. We just deal with the circumstances as they come. And I know that can be pretty depressing. That can be anxiety-inducing. That can be full of pressure and full of a lack of joy. So sometimes we run and sometimes we just stay. But sometimes, and this might be true especially for men, is we try to say, you know what? I'm just going to force my way through it. I feel stuck and I'm just going to force my way through it. It reminds me of an Army Ranger credo. Now, looking at me, you know that I've never been an Army Ranger. But one of the things that in their credo that I really admire to a degree, it goes like this. It says, I will never forsake my comrades. I will shoulder more than my share of the task, whatever it may be, 100% and then some. Isn't that a manly response? That we're going to do whatever it takes to go up, around, through, to get through our circumstances when we feel stuck. This struck me the other day at the hospital where I work, a gentleman came in and he had his Army Ranger hat on. And he was so flustered because he had lost his way in the hospital, something so easy to navigate in some ways, and yet he had lost his ways. And I bet you in the 2-minute conversation I had with him, I bet 5 times he apologized, and he kept on telling me, I'm an Army Ranger, I should know how to do this. And that's kind of like we are when we get stuck, when we don't know the way out. We try to force our way, or we make apologies for it. And so the question that really is before us today is what do we do when we feel stuck? What do we do when the way forward seems so uncertain, yet the way back is unavailable? Like we can't go back. And maybe even if we could go back, maybe the going back is so undesirable. Maybe you don't want to go back to that relationship or to that job. And so we find ourselves just in this place of in the middle, just being stuck. And certainly with the pandemic that we've all been dealing with for the last 3 or 4 months, I think that instills in all of us a sense of stuckness. Yet at the same time, there might be other things that you're dealing with. Maybe some of you are so stuck that you don't see the light at the end of the tunnel because right now you can't even see the tunnel. And there have been times in my life where I've experienced exactly that sense of just being in no man's land. Of feeling like I don't know the way forward and I don't know the way back, and here I am just right in the middle of all this. And there's a guy in the Bible who we can relate to. His name is David. And whether you're a church person or not, all of us have probably heard the story of David and Goliath, this lowly shepherd boy who comes and rescues Israel by defeating the giant Goliath. We've all heard that story before. But there's other stories of David that you might be familiar with. Maybe it was his deep, intimate relationship with his friend Jonathan. Perhaps it was the affair that he had with Bathsheba. Perhaps you know David because of the Psalms that he wrote. But David was a guy who had moments where he was feeling stuck and then moments where he was feeling free and where he had momentum in his life. David was a guy, no matter if he was just a poor shepherd boy or if he was the king, dealt with stuckness. And I think that's a good reminder for all of us. It doesn't matter our position. It doesn't matter our pay grade. We can all have experiences of feeling stuck. There were times when David felt very close to God, and there were times where he felt distant from God. There was times when he felt like he had momentum, and then there were times when he felt like he was just floundering. There was times when he was flourishing, and there was time when he was on his knees asking for forgiveness. So David is a very unique character. David is someone that we can relate to because we all deal with seasons in our life where we might be feeling really good about the way things are going. And maybe that's you today. Maybe you're watching today and you feel like, no, you're not stuck, that everything is going up and to the right and it's going in a positive direction. And I would say that that is fantastic and we're excited about that for you. But certainly there's been seasons in our lives where that hasn't always been the case, where we've had moments where we just feel like we're being dragged down, like we have nowhere to go, where we can't even see what the future would look like. And for many of us, that becomes filled with hopelessness and despair and anxiety and stress. And David can relate to all of that. If you've ever spent time reading the Psalms, it's really a lot of it is a memoir of his life. And I don't know when all of it was written. Some of it was probably written toward the end of his life. Some of it might have been written while he was going through the experience. And so what I want to spend a little bit of time doing today is going through some of the lessons that David can teach us, looking at some of the habits that I believe David incorporated into his life when he was feeling stuck. So if you have a Bible or you have a phone or some kind of electronic device in front of you and you want to follow along, I think that would be fantastic. We're going to be looking at 7 verses from Psalm 27. The first 6 verses of that psalm deal with David's gratitude for how God has come to his rescue. Times when he wasn't feeling stuck, where he saw God move in his life, where he was able to experience the joy and the goodness of who God is. And like so many psalms that David writes, they take a little bit of a turn, a little bit of a twist. And we kind of sense the fact that maybe now David is not feeling as positive as he was. And again, we don't know exactly when he wrote these. Maybe he wrote the first part in the morning and the second part before he went to bed at night. We're not exactly sure how all of that was transcribed. But one thing we do know, and that's because we have it as part of the scriptures, of the Bible, is that we know that these are God's words. Even though David wrote them for us, They're a message to us from God. And I think we can all learn from some of the things that David experiences, some of the habits that he created when he felt stuck. So I'm going to begin by reading the 7 verses, and then we're going to come back. So if you have a Bible, you can read along with me. Psalm 27, starting in verse 7. David writes, Lord, hear my voice when I call. Be gracious to me and answer me. My heart says this about you, seek his face. Lord, I will seek your face. Do not hide your face from me. Do not turn your servant away in anger. You have been my helper. Do not leave me or abandon me. God of my salvation, even if my father and my mother abandon me, the Lord cares for me. Because of my adversary, show me your way, Lord, and lead me on a level path. Do not give me over to the will of my foes, for false witnesses rise up against me, breathing violence. I am certain that I will see the goodness of God in the land of the living. Wait for the Lord. Be strong and let your heart be courageous. Wait for the Lord. And within these verses, I believe that there are at least 6 habits that I want to identify that can help us when we feel stuck, when the way forward is so unclear, when we have no idea what tomorrow will bring, and yet the way back is nearly impossible for us to return to. The first habit is in verse 7. David writes, Lord, hear my voice when I call to you. Be gracious to me and answer me. My heart says this about you, seek his face. Lord, I will seek your face. So the first habit is to stay connected. I like how David says, when I call to you. Lord, hear me when I call to you. Not if I call to you, not that I might call to you. David had a habit of calling out to God when things got sticky. And so oftentimes, prayer for us can be the last resort, calling out to God to be something that we think of only later. And yet it seems that David has created this habit of calling out to God in the moments of his greatest desperation, his greatest need. But I like what he says after that as well. Be gracious to me and answer me. See, because from our own human perspective, we can't always understand what God might be doing. And I love that he asks for God's grace. Just to be gracious, like, give me some room here. Give me a little wiggle room. Because what I'm asking for might not be exactly what you want. What I need may not exactly be what you want to provide. And even more importantly than that, I may have gotten stuck because of something that I did. Maybe it was a decision that I made. Maybe things that I've done in my life has caused me to be stuck. It has nothing to do with outside circumstances. It all has to do with something that I have thought about or actions that I have taken. And David can certainly recognize those moments in his life. And so really he comes to God and says, God, I want to stay connected to you, but please be gracious. Please understand that I don't deserve this. I don't deserve you to hear me. I don't necessarily even deserve to be in your presence because of some things that I've done, but please be gracious. And as he continues that verse, just to seek his face, I will. There's a determination in there that there's no question about it. When things get sticky, when I feel stuck, I'm going to seek God's face. So the first habit is to stay connected. The second habit is to remember the past. If you look at verse 9, do not hide your face from me. Do not turn your servant away in anger. And here's the part I want to talk about. You have been my helper. David knew to look to God in the past. And so he's calling on God once again to say, be my helper again. We've been on this journey before once again, God. And as I talked about the last time I was with you, is that when the Israelites were entering into the land of Canaan, God reminded Joshua, set down stones so you can remember what I have done in your life. And that's the same thing that David is exhorting us to do. He's reminding us to do, is to say, remember the way God has been already at your aid, being able to help you. God has been a helper, and he wants to be able to continue to help us in our greatest times of need. And David recognized this. So if we're feeling stuck, we have to remember that what God has brought us through in the past. Maybe it was a rough spot in your relationship. Maybe you thought that the marriage was over, but somehow in a way that because of commitment and dedication and accountability, that marriage has survived. And you can look back and say, you know what, God did it once before and he can do it again. And maybe there have been many seasons of that in your life, but yet He can provide. Or think about the job situation. Maybe you were struggling. Maybe it wasn't what you had anticipated. Maybe the company, you feel like they've misled you or lied to you. And yet God came through in a certain way. He maybe perhaps brought you a new job or new responsibility or more money. And so we just have to remember that God has been our helper and He will help us again. The third habit is to know your standing or to know your position. Excuse me. Verse 10, even if my father and mother abandon me, the Lord cares for me. We have to remember that we are children of God, that we are fearfully and wonderfully made by Him. And David's proclamation to say, even if my mother and father abandon me, wasn't just like maybe they didn't like what I did, maybe we're not on speaking terms. For David to recognize that maybe because of decisions that he made, or maybe because of what's going on in his life, that his mother and father, those who gave him life, aren't close to him, that was a sense of not just being estranged from your parents. That had to do with your social standing. That had to do with your economic viability, because who you were and your family connections meant everything in that day. And maybe to a lesser degree, they mean that now. But I remember, and as I've shared with before, and some of you might have heard more of the stories of our adopted children. And I remember speaking to a Russian gentleman. He was an exchange student in the town where we lived, and he came over to our house for dinner, and we were talking to him about our family. And with our kids sitting there, now thankfully they were too young to understand all of this, but as they were sitting there listening to him talk about orphans in Russia, he said they are like the lowest member of society. They deserve to be at the bottom of the pack. They are like the lowest on the totem pole. And I couldn't believe he was saying that. But that's really what David is reflecting, is that if you don't have a family of origin, then you're really worthless. But I love what David says, because he understands his position. He knows who he belongs to. He said, if no one else cares for me, God, I know that you care for me. The writer of 1 Peter says that casting all your cares upon the Lord, for He cares for you. That He's caring for you. He understands the difficulty. He knows what we're going through. It's not lost on Him. He's a God who is all-knowing, and that we can trust Him and we can understand and know our position. We can know our standing because we know that God loves us and He's deeply aware of what's going on in our lives. So when we feel stuck, we can rely on that. When everything else and everybody else seems like they've abandoned us, we know that God is still on our side. So those are 3 habits so far. Stay connected. Remember the past. Know your standing. And the 4th one is to be available. Be available. Verse 11. Because of my adversaries, show me your way, Lord, and lead me on a level path. He is asking for God to do something in the moment. Show me and lead me. If we're not paying attention to what God is doing in our moments of stuckness, we'll never be able to see what God is doing, and we'll never be able to follow where He is going. And I know sometimes feeling stuck is so overwhelming that we can't see that. That's why I love the song Waymaker, that even when we can't see it, He's working. Even when we can't feel it, He's doing something in our lives. And David gets this. It's a habit that he created. It's a habit that we can create. It's to still be aware, because here's the reality. Is being stuck doesn't mean you need to be stagnant. It doesn't mean that we need to stay still. The very first Bible study that I went through as a new believer, about 24 years old, got together with a group of people in a living room, spent Friday evenings with this group, fell in love with this group. By the way, if you're not in a group, I think it'd be a great opportunity for you to join a group, because it helps us spiritually, helps us to grow. It helps us in our times when we're stuck. But I remember doing this study that's still popular today, some 30 years later, and that's Experiencing God by Henry Blackaby. And I remember the point that he was talking about. He was saying, we all go through a crisis of belief. Well, maybe that's because we're stuck. And one of the things that we're supposed to do is he encouraged us to be able to look for God, where God is already at work. And that's really the heartbeat of being shown and to being led, is to be aware of what God is doing around us. And so I really find a lot of encouragement in this one habit of just being able to be available to what God might still want to be doing in your life. We don't have to resign ourselves to being stuck, that's the way it's going to be. We don't need to run from it. We just need to stay there in the moment and to be able to say, okay, God, show me what you're up to in this moment, because right now I don't see it. The next habit is to stay hopeful. Verse 13, I am certain that I will see the Lord's goodness in the land of the living. There's a sense that when we lose hope, we lose everything. Proverbs 13:12 says, hope deferred or hope delayed makes the heart sick. When there's nothing that we can find hope in, we just get weary. And our stuckness feels like it's overwhelming. And every day it's like an Eeyore day where we wake up and nothing seems positive, nothing seems to be going our way. And really, what David is reminding of us is that he has this confidence. He can't see it. He doesn't know what it is, but he knows that he's going to find God again. He's going to find joy. He's going to find life in the land of the living. And sometimes it takes a little bit of effort, quite honestly, to find hope. Because we might consider ourselves optimistic individuals, that doesn't mean there's always going to be things that we can look to find optimism in. Or it might be really hard to be able to do that. I encourage people that I work with a lot in the hospital who are having significant health challenges to find some hope in their life. And honestly, the outcome isn't always going to be good. I was talking to a gentleman just recently, and the only hope that I could bring him was to be able to enjoy a cold glass of water. It was kind of a surreal moment. He was a younger gentleman, and yet his life was soon going to be over on this earth. And to be able to encourage him, just be able to find hope in something. And sometimes even in this life, the hope we have is eternity. If you're a follower of Jesus, the hope we have is eternity. Maybe this life will never be what you just thought it would be. Maybe it hasn't gone according to your design, according to your blueprint. And so every moment might feel like we're stuck. And yet God holds out this hope of eternity. The Bible reminds us there is going to be a new kingdom and a new earth. And for those of us who have put our faith in Jesus, can certainly experience that reality. So there will be hope. So the fifth habit was to stay hopeful. And the last habit that I want to identify is to remain steadfast. Remain steadfast. Be secure in your relationship with God. Be secure in your faith, knowing that God is at work. Verse 14 says, wait for the Lord. Be strong and let your heart be courageous. Wait for the Lord. There's this idea of just that we need to remain steadfast. We need to be anchored to the truth. And as I read that, it's almost like David is saying, wait while you're waiting. And I don't like that idea. I don't want to wait long. I don't want to wait while I'm waiting. It seems like that's what David is saying. You just hold on, that it's going to be okay, that you're going to get through this, that God is going to do something in your life to remain steadfast. The writer of 1 Corinthians, Paul, says this in verse 15:58. Therefore, brothers and sisters, be immovable, steadfast, excelling in the work of the Lord, for your work is not in vain. If we do work, if we actively pursue God and what He's doing, even in our moments of stuckness, that work is not in vain. God is going to use that some way. And so these 6 habits can be helpful. Let me read them again. And maybe you can identify what habit resonates most with you. What do you need to work on in your moments of stuckness? Stay connected. Remember the past. Know your standing. Be available. Stay hopeful. Remain steadfast. And that's a great list. Those are some great practices to have in our lives. But in some ways, without God's intervention, without God's Spirit working in our lives, any self-help expert could read a list like this, and it would be true and it might be helpful. But really what's going to be transforming is not the list. It's not about our commitment to the habits. It's about our commitment to what God is doing in our lives. Because when we follow these commitments, when we practice these habits, it reveals the character and the nature of God. See, the bad news, which is really good news, or if you want to say it a different way, the good news, which sounds like bad news, is that we're always going to be stuck in this life. Sin has a way of dragging us down. Those things that we do that don't line up with what God would want for us will always have consequences and always have ways of putting us in this place of being stuck. It might not be for a long season, But it will be true that we will have these moments like we just want to be freed. We want to be rescued from the moments where we're in. And yet God uses each and one of those moments. So maybe instead of just thinking about stuck as something negative, and even if we practice these habits, maybe we need to change our perspective of what God might be doing in our moments of stuckness. I know that there's a way that God provides when we're stuck, that God is working out His perfect plan, His provision. Maybe you're trying to sell a house, and the reason why you haven't sold your house yet is because the person who's going to buy it hasn't been offered the job yet into the city where they're going to be moving. And maybe the reason why they haven't been offered the job yet is because the person at the company that's going to hire them hasn't quit yet. So oftentimes we look at those isolated moments and say, my house isn't selling. I need to sell my house. And we don't understand the bigger picture of what God is already doing. So the change of perspective, say, no, in these moments, God is providing for me. Maybe you've wanted a spouse for a long time, or maybe you're looking for someone else to spend your life with, and God has not provided that yet. But we don't know all the intricacies of what God is already doing. We had a close friend in another state that we lived in. I remember having conversation with her, my wife and I, about how she just wanted to be married, how she wanted to find the right person. And she was almost 50 years old before she found that right person. And the person who had proposed to her and where they're going to spend their life together now, something had to happen in his life. Unfortunately, it was tragic. He had lost his wife to a serious illness. But God had arranged all that. And now it's a beautiful picture of the way that God is providing. So when we feel stuck, sometimes we just have to recognize God is providing. The second thing that we could change our perspective with is to know that maybe it's just that God is protecting us in moments of stuckness. I'm reminded of the great theologian Garth Brooks, who said, I thank God for unanswered prayers. And that would be true for all of us. We can look back in our lives when we prayed something that we thought was going to be just right. We wanted it to be God's will for us. And yet we're so grateful that God didn't answer that prayer. Sometimes we're just stuck in order for protection. Maybe it's from just outside forces or circumstances that we don't even see coming yet, but God knows, and we have to trust Him in that. And while those are really good perspectives to adapt, in addition to those habits, I think there's one perspective that we often miss, that we often want to overlook, because perhaps it's the most difficult. And that is that God wants to create in us the likeness of His Son, Jesus. He wants us to become more like His Son. He wants us to reflect more of His glory. And oftentimes when we're feeling down, when we feel like things aren't going our way, again, when we just feel stuck, that's when God can be shaping us and pruning us and conforming us more to the image of His Son. Because again, when we can live that way, no one's going to be impressed with the habits that we've created. But what they will be impressed with is the way that we can reflect God. When they can see God in us, when they can see that there's a bigger picture to what their life represents. Because David found this as well. I want to flip over and up to Psalm 40. Just the first 3 verses of Psalm 40. I waited patiently for the Lord. Remember earlier he said just wait on the Lord. So now he's telling us what happened when he found himself stuck. He waited patiently for the Lord, and He turned to me and He heard my cry for help. He brought me up from a desolate pit. In our lives, pits happen. We're going to find ourselves stuck. He rescued David out of the muddy clay and set his feet upon the rock. Verse 3, He put a new song in my mouth, a hymn of praise to our God. Many will see and fear, and they will trust in the Lord. You see what David recognized, and what we need to recognize, is that God is doing something in our lives that isn't about us, but it's all about Him. It's all to reflect what He has done, His love for people, His grace for people, His mercy for people. We are His conduits. We are His ambassadors. And so living this life of stuckness is not some type of punishment. Sure, there are consequences for things that we do and choices that we make that may put us stuck, but we can reshape that. We can reframe that. We can use it for a bigger purpose. Again, if you know the story of David and Bathsheba and the horrors that he committed murder in order to try to protect himself. And yet God still used him in a powerful way. If you have a moment later today or this week, Read Psalm 51. It's all about how David found himself stuck, and yet he was crying out to God to do something good in his life. And based on this psalm that we just read, in part Psalm 40, we can see that God did come to his rescue. He was doing something in the moments of David's stuckness. I don't know where you find yourself stuck right now. I know certainly where I can identify places where I feel stuck, and the reality is that's just a fact of life. Things aren't always going to be the way we want them, but God knows how things are going. And God has a bigger plan than any of us can imagine or any of us can see. And so when we feel stuck, yes, practice the habits, but also change our perspective to see that God is providing for us. He has provided for us. He is protecting us. He has protected us, and he's shaping us more into the image of his Son. I hope you found this message helpful. Let me just have a word of prayer with you. God our Father, we cannot even say thank you enough for the innumerable times that you have come to our rescue, that when things were looking dark, when things were looking uncertain, you came and you did something. Maybe we couldn't see it in the moment, but you have revealed your perfect plan to us. And you're revealing your perfect plan through us to the world, that your kingdom is greater, that your love is superior, that your presence is real. So let us walk in the sense of knowing that even when we feel stuck, even when we don't know the way forward, you do. Allow us to remain steadfast. And God, I pray that if anyone has watched this message, is watching this message and feels like they don't even have a relationship with you, that they are so far removed from you, that today they would begin an exploration of discovering the freedom that they can find in you, that you would give them purpose to their life. So we ask all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Thanks for listening and have a great day.